What is diplomacy? Diplomacy is the art and practice of conducting negotiations between representatives of states. It usually refers to international diplomacy, the conduct of international relations through the intercession of professional diplomats with regard to a full range of topical issues. International treaties are usually negotiated by diplomats prior to endorsement by national politicians. The term diplomacy is derived via French from the ancient Greek diploma, composed of diplo, meaning folded in two, and the suffix ma, meaning an object. The folded document conferred a privilege, often a permit to travel, on the bearer, and the term came to denote documents through which princes granted such favors. Later it applied to all solemn documents issued by chancelleries, especially those containing agreements between sovereigns. Diplomacy is a basic means by which a nation seeks to secure the goals of its national interest. Foreign policy always travels on the shoulders of diplomacy and gets operationalized in other states. The term diplomacy is used in a variety of ways. Sometimes it is described as the art of telling lies on behalf of the nation, or as instrument for employing deceit and duplicity in international relations. Diplomacy is the process of representation and negotiation by which states customarily deal with one another in times of peace. Paddleford and Lincoln. Diplomacy is the application of intelligence and tact to the conduct of official relations between governments of independent states. Sir Ernest Satow. Diplomacy is a art of forwarding one's interests in relation to other countries. K.M. Panikkar. Diplomacy is the management of international relations by means of negotiations, the method by which these relations are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys. The business or art of the diplomats. Harold Nicholson. Diplomacy is the promotion of the national interest by peaceful means. Hans J. Morgenthau. Nature of diplomacy. Diplomacy is not immoral. Diplomacy is neither the art of deceit nor mere lies or propaganda, and nor even something immoral. Diplomacy is a means of international relations. Diplomacy is a normal means of conducting relations. It consists of techniques and procedures for conducting relations among nations. Diplomacy is machinery for action. In itself, diplomacy is recognized as official machinery for the conduct of relations among nations. Diplomacy acts through settled procedures. Diplomacy functions through a network of foreign offices, embassies, legations, consulates, and special missions all over the world. It always works according to definite and settled procedures and protocol.
Bilateral as well as multilateral in form, diplomacy is commonly bilateral in character. However, as a result of the growing importance of international conferences, international organizations, regional negotiations, it has now also developed a plural character. It is concerned with all issues and problems among nations. Diplomacy handles all types of matters. Diplomacy may embrace a multitude of interests, from the simplest issues to vital issues to that of war and peace.
Breakdown of diplomacy always leads to crisis. When diplomacy breaks down, the danger of war, or at least of a major crisis, develops. Diplomacy operates both in times of peace as well as war. Some writers hold that diplomacy operates only in times of peace, and when war breaks out, diplomacy comes to an end. However, this is not a correct view. Diplomacy continues to operate even when war breaks out. Of course, during war its nature undergoes a change. From peace diplomacy it takes the form of war diplomacy.
Diplomacy works in an environment characterized both by conflict and cooperation. Diplomacy works in a situation involving both cooperation and conflict. A certain degree of cooperation among nations is essential for the working of diplomacy, because in its absence, diplomatic relations cannot be maintained. Similarly, when there is no conflict, diplomacy becomes superfluous because there is no need for negotiations. Thus existence of cooperation as well as conflict is essential for the working of diplomacy. Diplomacy always works for securing national interests of the nation it represents. The purpose of diplomacy is to secure goals of national interest as defined and specified by the foreign policy of the nation. Diplomacy always works for the nation it represents. Diplomacy is backed by national power. A strong diplomacy means a diplomacy backed by a strong national power. Diplomacy uses persuasion and influence as the means for exercising power in international relations. It cannot use force and violence. However, it can issue warnings, give ultimatums, promise rewards and threaten punishment, but beyond this it cannot directly exercise force. Diplomacy is the promotion of national interest by peaceful means. Test of success of diplomacy.
Success in diplomacy is measured in terms of the amount of success achieved towards the fulfillment of the goals of national interest in international relations. Objectives of diplomacy. Political objectives of diplomacy. Diplomacy always works to secure the goals of national interest as defined by the foreign policy. It always works for increasing the influence of the state over other states. It uses persuasion, promises of rewards and other such means for this purpose. Through rational negotiations, it seeks to justify the objectives of the foreign policy of the nation. It seeks to promote friendship and cooperation with other nations. Non-political objectives of diplomacy. The interdependence among nations is the most important and valuable fact of international living. Each nation depends upon others for economic and industrial links and trade. Diplomacy always seeks to promote the economic, commercial, and cultural links of the nation with other nations. Diplomacy depends upon peaceful means, persuasive methods for promoting the interests of the nation, and this is indeed an important non-political objective of diplomacy. 6 main devices of diplomacy. Promise of reward and concessions. Persuasion.
Reward, threat of use of force, non-violent punishment, use of pressure. Representation, negotiations, protection of interest, change in the character of diplomacy, old diplomacy, European diplomacy, aristocratic, special emphasis upon virtues, secrecy, freedom of action for the ambassadors, new diplomacy and distinction with old diplomacy. New diplomacy is global, old diplomacy was mainly European, new diplomacy is mostly multilateral, whereas old diplomacy was mostly bilateral. New diplomacy is less formal than old diplomacy. New diplomacy is mostly open and old diplomacy was mostly secret. The new diplomacy is democratic. New diplomacy depends more on propaganda than old diplomacy. Different types of diplomacy. Preventive diplomacy, public diplomacy, soft power, economic diplomacy, counterinsurgency diplomacy, gunboat diplomacy, appeasement, nuclear diplomacy.
Preventive diplomacy is action to prevent disputes from arising between parties, to prevent existing disputes from escalating into conflicts and to limit the spread of the latter when they occur. Since the end of the Cold War, the international community through international institutions has been focusing on preventive diplomacy. Public diplomacy is exercising influence through communication with the general public in another nation, rather than attempting to influence the nation's government directly. This communication may take the form of propaganda, or more benign forms such as citizen diplomacy, individual interactions between average citizens of 2 or more nations. Technological advances and the advent of digital diplomacy now allow instant communication with foreign publics, and methods such as Facebook diplomacy and Twitter diplomacy are increasingly used by world leaders and diplomats. Economic diplomacy. Economic diplomacy is the use of foreign aid or other types of economic policy as a means to achieve a diplomatic agenda. Economic diplomacy. Soft power, sometimes called hearts and minds diplomacy, as defined by Joseph Nye, is the cultivation of relationships, respect, or even admiration from others in order to gain influence, as opposed to more coercive approaches. Often and incorrectly confused with the practice of official diplomacy, soft power refers to non-state, culturally attractive Factors that may predispose people to sympathize with a foreign culture based on affinity for its products, such as the American entertainment industry, schools, and music.
Counterinsurgency diplomacy or expeditionary diplomacy, developed by diplomats deployed to civil military stabilization efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, employs diplomats at tactical and operational levels, outside traditional embassy environments and often alongside military or peacekeeping forces. Counterinsurgency diplomacy may provide political environment advice to local commanders, interact with local leaders, and facilitate the governance efforts, functions and reach of a host government.
Gunboat diplomacy is the use of conspicuous displays of military strength as a means of intimidation in order to influence others. It must also be stated that since gunboat diplomacy lies near the edge between peace and war, victory or defeat in an incident may foster a shift into political and psychological dimensions. A standoff between a weaker and a stronger state may be perceived as a defeat for the stronger one. This was the case in the Pueblo incident, in which the Americans lost face with regard to North Korea.
Appeasement is a policy of making concessions to an aggressor in order to avoid confrontation. Because of its failure to prevent World War II, appeasement is not considered a legitimate tool of modern diplomacy.
Nuclear diplomacy is the area of diplomacy related to preventing nuclear proliferation and nuclear war. One of the most well-known and most controversial philosophies of nuclear diplomacy is mutually assured destruction, MAD.